Right. So before we start, thanks to Eduardo for giving me this opportunity to present Naralo. Eduardo thinks that I'm an expert on this topic. I told him I was not really an expert. There are others much better suited, perhaps, to run this kind of webinars. But Eduardo said this is a kind of at large, maybe slightly simplified way of looking at this EPDP. So this is what I would be covering. Some common questions. In fact, Eduardo has proposed a bunch of questions. Some basic information on IDNs, the work done so far, the EPDP, the rationale and scope, and the current status. So these questions, I found them very useful because some of them may look, rather simple to some of the experts, but for the end user who's grappling with this question of what is this creature, this EPDP? Why should it be different from regular PDP? What is the difference, and what are IDNs all about? So these are the basic questions that Eduardo has listed. I'm not getting into reading them, but some interesting questions. For instance, number 3: why did it take us 10 years to work on an IDN policy and still we haven't reached the end of the road? What is the difference between an EPDP and a regular PDP? Now, but number 4 is technically speaking outside the remit of this webinar, but there are some excellent documents available with ICANN, which compares the regular PDP with an EPDP, and there are some differences, and this is expedited, as the name says. Then some technical stuff: how are they delegated? What are variants? Is UA part of EPDP? Technically, no. What else is being considered? So here are the basic information about domain names. Domain names are composed of labels separated by dots. So www.google.com would be 3 labels: www, Google, and com. Now, each label is composed of the letters A to Z and numerals 0 to 9 and the hyphen character of the Latin character set. Now, this character set is the restricted character set for domain names is called LDH, letter digit hyphen. And you compose these using these characters. The dot is a delimiter. Each label can be up to 63 characters long. It is not possible to use any other script, special characters, or emojis to construct labels in the basic DNS. But unfortunately, if you cannot use anything but Latin, it excludes numerous scripts or writing systems used by a number of languages around the world. And therefore, it precludes a truly multilingual internet. Now, here we see that we have to differentiate between languages, scripts, and writing systems. Language is what is spoken. Writing systems or scripts are the representation on paper or on the computer. There are various kinds of crazy overlaps. There are languages that use multiple scripts, like Japanese, which uses 4. There are multiple languages that use the same script. In India, we have a bunch of languages using the same script. So there are all these kinds of overlaps that are possible. But from an inclusive, truly multilingual internet, we need working domains in multiple scripts. So domain names also imply URLs, email IDs, and other artifacts that we create out of these domain names. So this is a big picture why we want to think of IDNs, because they are a hell of a bother, actually. And the true reason why we've not done it even after 10 years is that it is complex. Now, what is an IDN? An IDN is a domain name that has at least one non-Latin character in its label. Now, one fundamental takeaway from this webinar is that there are 3 ways in which IDNs are implemented at present. Now, the earliest of this, since 2003, was IDNs at the 2nd level. So you can see here is busher.com and this particular .org. The top level domains are the regular top level domains. But at the second level, we have special characters that are not Latin. In this case, this is German and this is Hindi or Devanagari. So that's the first type at the 2nd level. Now, this is the least impact on, from a resilience or stability perspective, because .com and .org are established TLDs. And it is only at the 2nd level that we are, so it is actually the simpler of all the options. The next one is IDN-based CCTLDs. Now here we see examples of, this is Thai, and so this is the what is in English .th, and this is the Cyrillic, which is the Russian language, and this is .ru. And this one is actually in a language that is mostly spoken in India, but also in Sri Lanka. And this CCTLD belongs to Sri Lanka. This has been available since 2010. The third is new GTLDs in IDNs. So this has been since around from 2012 onwards, this has been available, but the actual the domain started being available from 2013. They were included in the 12 round. Now, because DNS still resolves using the LDH, letter digit hyphen, IDNs cannot be used as such to resolve. So they are internally converted to LDH through the mechanism called ASCII compatible encoding, ACE. And the resulting thing is called Unicode, which is a pun on Unicode. And Unicode looks like this. The first 4 characters are always XN hyphen hyphen. And what follows is a kind of conversion of the special character or script into pure LDH. Now, we are currently using domain names based on a lot of work done by the Unicode Consortium, IETF, the ICANN community, and the ICANN board. This is actually quite a bit of work that has been done. And Unicode, the difficulty is that these are all different organizations with different culture, but we have to arrive at a common vocabulary, common way of working together. Now, at the second level, that is the first category that we talked about. The document that was helpful in the early adoption of IDNs at the second level was something called the IDN Implementation Guidelines. So this document has been driving the second level IDNs, which was the earliest 2003 onwards. This document has been now kind of revised several times. The last one was the 4th, which was completed in 2018. But GNSO said they want further time for reviewing it. So we are still following 3.0, although 4.0 has been ready since 2018. And one of the things that we will see that later down the presentation is that GNSO will be looking at the 4.0 versions. They have some concerns and they'll be looking at it. So that was about the second level. How about what is driving the CCTLD based IDNs? In 2009, ICANN board approved the final implementation plan for IDN CCTLD fast track process. So this is the process that launched CCTLD based IDNs. So the ICANN board resolution said that the implementation plan requires strings to be meaningful representation of a country or a territory, and is supported by the government and the community. It also requires the string to be reviewed by independent experts for technical considerations and string similarity. Now, this document is also being updated. There have been multiple versions. The latest version we have is 2019. And this is the status of IDN-based CCTLDs. There are 62 CCTLDs from 43 countries. And India, you can see this big stack here, has the maximum diversity of scripts. We have 22 languages and 15 scripts. And all of them have been now are available for as a CCTLD TLD. Now, the third category is IDN generic top-level domain, GTLDs. Now, here is where we have a lot of problems, actually, practically. While preparing for the 2012 round in 2007, GNSO suggested several principles and recommendations. The first is that some of the new GTLDs that would come out in 2012 should be IDNs, subject to approval for IDNs in the root zone. And the reasons for introducing new IDN-based GTLDs is, it includes that there is demand from potential applicants for new top-level domains in ASCII and IDN both. And they also put forth the recommendation. If an applicant offers an IDN service, then they should follow the IDN implementation guidelines. So this is the status of, sorry, apologies for that. There are 92 IDN GTLDs available currently. And these were the first 4 the Arabic word for web, the Russian word for online, Russian for website, and Chinese for game. So, so basically, this has been the work done so far. And there have been other challenges that we have not worked much with. And one of them, probably the most important of them, is IDN variance. So we have been kind of sidestepping this problem by various, kind of shortcuts or, temporary kind of adjustments. And what are these IDN variants? Now, when you look at language communities, which are the community of people who use or speak a certain language, they may use two words as variants. For instance, I put here color and color. Now, we don't even recognize the two as different. We think they are the same. Now, this one, AE, can also be written in some languages, for example, Portuguese, as this combined glyph. Now, these are identical. And when you look at a word that contains this, we consider them to be exactly the same. And some languages like Arabic have large numbers of variant characters, which can be substituted. Now, some languages have multiple scripts. Chinese has traditional and simplified scripts. And the same word looks different depending on the script, but the community considers both forms to be the same. But unfortunately, to the computer that is trying to resolve this, these are completely different strings. We have to take special action if we want both of them to behave the same way as regular domain names. We can't also treat them as completely independent because later on we will see the same entity constraint. When you have variants, they must be allocated, they must be applied for by the same organization. There should be, the registry should be the same entity for both the variants or whatever number of variants you have. And imagine the case when you want to transfer a domain name from one registry to another, these two have to go lockstep. So it creates substantial, kind of downstream effects when we look at variants. Variants can be a cause for user confusion. If a label uses multiple variant code points, then, so that means, suppose you have a GTLD that is using variants, and then you have a second label, you have another word that's also using variants. Now this becomes a combinatorial explosion. The numbers of the allowable variants rise rapidly. And looking at the history of the work that we have done, we have not been able to precisely define IDN variants. And so we have sidestepped the issue through temporary placeholders. Now, this is not unusual. We have been grappling with an issue like DNS abuse for how much, 20 plus years or even more. But we only defined it properly maybe the last year when it became too much of a concern. So the fact that it has not been defined is not necessarily bad, but when you look at how to define it, that is the complexity that we are grappling with in this EPDP. Now, what was the placeholder for the CCTLDs? So in the fast track process, the following was the placeholder mechanism. The variant TLDs desired by the requester for delegation must be indicated by the requester. So the requester had to kind of think of what are the variants and what do I want. Desired variant TLDs will be allocated to the requester if successfully evaluated in order to be reserved to the entitled manager for potential future delegation. It's potential future delegation. It's not as if it is delegated already. But what is guaranteed is that nobody else will get that variant. A list of non-desired variants will be generated based on the received IDN tables and placed on block list. So the idea is that you either allow them or block them. Do not leave them in limbo. And the CCNSO community is still working with this problem, not completely solved, but going ahead with resolving them. And for the new GTLDs, the 2012 application guidebook had the following instructions. When you apply for a IDN TLD, the applicant may also declare any variant TLDs for the TLD in its application. However, no variant strings will be delegated through the new GTLD program until variant management solutions are developed and implemented. So you can claim that this is a variant of what I'm applying for, but you don't get it. You don't get to it. It will be reserved or blocked. It won't be allocated to anybody else, but it won't be delegated. Declaring variant strings is informative only and will not imply any right or claim to be declared variant strings. Whenever a variant delegation process is established, applicants may be required to submit additional information such as implementation details and may need to participate in subsequent evaluation process, which could contain additional fees and review steps. Now, this is a worrying factor for many. How do we have to repeat the same thing as a new string? That is a very elaborate, expensive process. These are actually not new strings; they are variants. So, can there be a special case? And that's one of the questions that the EPDP will look at. So, initial work on IDN variant TLDs. So, the board had resolved in 2010 that no variants of GTLDs will be delegated through the new GTLD program until appropriate variant management solutions are developed. This is 11 years back. We have not done so far. We are now trying to attempt this. In 2011, ICANN launched the variant issues project for 5 languages: Arabic, Chinese, Cyrillic, Devanagari, Greek, and Latin. And this particular initiative, now if you look behind at the history of IDN programs, there have been at least something between half a dozen and a dozen reports done by various groups on grappling with these problems of how to kind of take variants forward. And this particular report identifies 2 main gaps. First gap, as we mentioned, is that there is no definition of IDN variant TLDs. So to overcome this, what they did was to create a new process called the Root Zone Language Generation Rules, LGR. And this particular standard was created through community consultations. In 2013, ICANN board resolved to adopt the Root Zone LGR. And this one involves a generation panel and an integration panel. Now, the problem here is again that languages are opaque to non-speakers of the language. So if you see an email which is IDN, you do not know how to interpret it. Where is it coming from? Because a Roman email, you at least know, okay, it's Gmail or it's coming from a particular CCTLD, which country. But if you look at an IDN email on both sides of the @ you are unable to read what this is all about. So that remains still a user experience problem, that there's no easy way to kind of evaluate an email ID. Now, a quick and dirty way out of this is to strip those dots in between and place the whole thing in Google Translate. In some cases, Google Translate gives you kind of not very meaningful, but reasonably meaningful kind of results. So the idea of a generation panel is a small group containing experts on that language who will decide what is to be used, what are the rules to be applied, what are the variants, and as you can see the next picture, there is a generation panel for every language, but with some exceptions. Like I said, CGK Chinese script has got 3 GPs. It is as if the same script is used by 3 different languages, whereas the Neo-Brahmi GP looks at 9 scripts, or probably more than that also. So there are these overlaps of all kinds, but the principle is that 1 language, 1 generation panel. And they hand the work over to the integration panel, who evaluates the work and then decides to accept or reject. And then the LGR rules are kind of worked, and you finally have the delegation of to the root. So the generation panel generates proposals for script-specific LGRs based on community expertise and linguistic security and stability requirements. Now, we must note that we are coming to that actually. We are not using all the features of a language as it is presented by the Unicode code points on that language. We are using a very small subset, very small in the sense, a limited subset of those code points. A code point is a single character encoded in Unicode. So generation panels look at language-specific issues, and integration panel tries to integrate all of them. And label generation rules, it decides what is permissible, what variants exist, etc. So this is the current status of Eduardo. Can you please interrupt me when I have 5 minutes left so that I can wind up? Don't put it in chat because I'm not looking at chat. Please interrupt the voice itself. Thank you. So this is the current situation. The panels, so many languages have already done, and this is actually a progress. This is good progress that we have done so many, but there are still some lagging behind. Now, what is actually what are the general principles for forming or creating labels for domain names? TLDs are intended for unambiguous labels with good mnemonic value. They don't represent anything more. There's no meaning, there's no semantics. You can't represent anything more than just a mnemonic through a label. It is not intended to capture all facets of a writing system. It should focus on modern everyday use. So if you have a character set that, for instance, Devanagari character sets contains a lot of characters used 3000 years ago in Sanskrit language, which are no longer contemporary. So we don't have to use them for a DNS, for a domain name. So there is a process of filtering out these kind of characters. It's okay not to support some conventions. For example, allowing the apostrophe does not support the apostrophe S for. So there is some loss, but it is the objective of DNS is to provide a easy to remember label that human beings can use. There's nothing beyond that. So some limits are necessary to reduce systemic risks. When you have a new script, what are the steps? The first thing is to kind of start with the Unicode characters, the full set of Unicode characters of that script. Now, it is good for us that Unicode has finished work on most of the prominent languages, including some constructed languages. And we have a starting point there. Now, Unicode does have updates. They keep adding a few characters or dropping a few. But that is the work is cumulative, and we always have the latest with everything. So we do have a problem if a character that we've been using since 2003 gets dropped by the Unicode consortium. So that is a contingency that we have to look at. So from the full list, a working set is created by dropping non-essential stuff like punctuations, joiners, historic characters, digits, religious, liturgic characters. In short, anything that is not in widespread daily use. Now, this is called this set of characters, which is a restrictive set, but which is enough for domain names. It's called the maximal starting repertoire. The current MSR version is 5.0. And label generation rules are formal specifications in XML that are used to decide, the language communities decide what combination of characters are permitted, what the whole label combinations are permitted. And since DNS labels are mnemonics, LGRs do not insist on grammar or meanings, so there is no semantic content in labels. So that is the first gap. The second gap, the first gap is there is no definition. The second gap is that no IDN TLD variant management mechanism. So here it gets somewhat technical. So we will remain at the higher level. So in 2019 March, ICANN.org published a 6-part report. This is again some monumental work. A report entitled IDN Variant TLD Recommendations that laid out 9. I'm not listing all the 9; it's available. So please note that if there is a kind of contention between what I am saying and the document of course prevails. These are all very detailed stuff, and one of the big problems in IDN work is that there are too many details. So the recommendations include the root zone LGR must be the only source for valid TLDs and the variants. Now, the IDN variant TLDs must be allocated to the same entity. Now here, if you remember, we had this character AE fused together, this glyph, and this AE separately. Now these are both TLDs, GTLDs, which are IDN variants. So the same entity constraint says that IDN variant TLDs must be allocated to the same entity. Same labels under variants must be registered to the same entity. So here we have this situation. You have a second level my shop. So if I'm registering my shop on this registry, then I should be, and only I should be allowed to register this one also. Because if somebody else can register, then it is a security problem. They can hijack my, because the user thinks both are the same. Now, suppose you have second level variants. That means the second level label, like my shop, actually has also variants. So then what will happen? Then you end up with 4 combinations. So this is the first, second, third. So here is the variant in the second level. So this way, if you are going to use a lot of variant code points, that is individual characters, you end up having a large number of variants to deal with. And existing policies and associated procedures for TLDs must be updated to accommodate the recommendations for IDN variant TLDs. All remaining existing TLD policies must apply to variance unless otherwise identified. So this is actually where we are, challenged actually. And now we move to Subpro's work on IDNs. Now, in preparation for the next round, which we don't know when it's going to come up, we have the Subpro working group, which again did a very large, the report was very extensive, and IDNs are referred to in that report, and that's where the EPDP comes from. So these pages 114 to 118, affirmation number 25.1, IDN new GTLDs continue to be an integral part of the new GTLD program. That's an affirmation. Recommendation 25.2, generation of TLDs and variant labels subject to compliance and checking. So all root zones LGRs must determine what label is blocked, what label is allocatable. And IDNA, I'm not going to get into details, but variant, where feasible, use of algorithmic checking. Can you, consider whether a particular variant is actually a variant? Can we check using an algorithm, or can we generate all variants of a string using an algorithm? Where the root zone LGR is not yet available, allow the application for this variant label. It can be processed, but no contracting or delegation, subject to further evaluation. Single character U label GTLDs allowed for limited script language combos. What is a U label? U label is what the non-Latin string looks like whatever Hindi language or Thai language, that is a Unicode label. When you convert it using ACE, you get the A label, ASCII label. Now, single character for some languages, like Chinese, etc., which are ideograph or ideogram, a single character represents a concept. So that is permitted subject to some constraints. This is recommendation 25.4. And in general, all IDN work is conservative. Wherever possible, there is explicit reason to be conservative, because we don't want any kind of stability issues or resilience issues for the root zone. So based on ICANN board resolutions, GNSS set up an IDN scoping team. They submitted a report in February 2020. That report proposed 2 tracks of work. One track to look at the IDN implementation guidelines that is released 2018, which is not taken up by GNSO. So this working group should look at what are the issues with that report. What is difficult for the registries to comply with. Track 2, an EPDP. Now here is where the request for an EPDP explicitly comes from. And an EPDP that would include how to define, manage, and coordinate IDN variant TLDs, how the IDN implementation guidelines, which is we talk about here at 4.0, should be revised in the future, because many of these things have to continuously keep getting updated, evolving actually. So one of the difference between a PDP and an EPDP is that a PDP does its own scoping generally, but in EPDP, it is explicitly taken out and the scoping is given to a different group before the EPDP starts. So presumably, I'm not sure why what the reason is, but presumably this is because of scope creep. If the same group decides its own scope, and there is a chance of that getting extended. So here for the EPDP, the scoping is done by a different team. That scoping is given to the EPDP when they start functioning. So the scoping team proposed 2 scopes. First is a definition and how they could be managed, that's variance. And secondly, how the IDN implementation guideline 4.0 could be updated in future. Now, these are the 2 core deliverables of the EPDP. How to define, how variance can be managed, and how the IDN implementation guidelines 4.0 could be updated in future. So the detailed scope, if you look at it, so the first thing is to define the issue of variance. Then the same entity, how to implement at the top level, same entity at the second level. What are the adjustments required in registry agreement, service, transition process, and other procedures that relate to the domain lifecycle. So like I said earlier, if you transfer a domain, which is a variant, the full set of variants have to move. And that may, even while applying for a second level domain, I might have to, the whole process might have to provide the option for asking for variance. So this is going to, significantly change a number of processes that we've been following so far. Adjustments to the objection process, string similarity review, string contention resolution, reserved strings, and other policies and procedures. Adjustments in registration, dispute resolution procedures, and trademark protection mechanisms. Process to update. So number 1 is one particular item. 2 to 6 are all about managing variants, and 7 is about how to update the IDN implementation guidelines. So as Eduardo said, the EPDP team/council has been seated, and the first meeting is scheduled for 11th. The output of the EPDP would make it feasible to conclude IDN variant labels in the new GTLDs, and also recommend a mechanism for periodic updating of the guidelines. And after a long while, we will make a significant step forward in, for a truly multilingual, inclusive internet. So that's my last slide. I thank you again for this opportunity, and back to Eduardo for moderating questions. Thanks, Eduardo. So I think there are others who can answer this question better, but my own take is that to the extent that this EPDP's work is independent, it will be done pretty fast. But if there are dependencies from the sub-pro group or any other group, then there may be a lag. But I think it is meant to operate fairly fast. Like you said, the main objective of having an EPDP in the first place is to expedite the whole process, so that I don't think it will run for long periods. It should be relatively short, assuming that it doesn't have dependencies on other groups.
Yes, thank you. This is Alfredo for the record. Satish, I'm just trying to grasp the framework or the charter of what this grouping with UR has to deal with. Now, I completely understand that you're dealing with the IDNs as a subgroup of the sub-pro process. So I'm guessing that there's sort of liaisons between all the other working groups within the sub-pro to make this happen in a short amount of time instead of waiting another 10 years? Thank you.
Thanks, Alfredo. Yeah, so the way this is structured is quite interesting, and it is new. And that is why in the ELAC call, we were saying that we should probably compare this model of representation, but open. So the way the EPDP team has been, or the EPDP council, I don't know which the right term, has been constituted is through official representatives of stakeholder groups, plus open participants and also observers, the three kind of categories. There are no direct liaisons between sub-pro and this one, but many people are common. For example, our own team consists of Justin, who is very much a part of the sub-pro group. So there is overlaps of people, but the constitution or the composition of the group is strictly by the constituency stakeholder group. Yeah, so I'll stop there. If you have any kind of follow-up question, I'll be happy to answer.
Yes, this is Alfredo again. I do have a follow-up question for you, Satish. So I'm guessing that there's a fixed number of representatives from each one of the constituencies or communities. Am I correct?
That's correct. The ELAC has 3 members who are allowed to vote. ELAC has 3 participants, again selected by ELAC, and observers. Anybody can sign up and look at the mailing list and all that. So the voting members are 3, and the participants are also 3. Participants can participate in the meeting, but observers, I suspect, cannot participate. They can only look at the mail.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. This is Steve Chan from staff. I actually support the GNSO, actually. And I just joined to actually take advantage of hearing Satish speak on the subject. And so I just raised my hand to hopefully provide a little bit of clarity on why an EPDP was chosen for this work. And so the key difference, as Satish mentioned, between an EPDP and a PDP is more or less the need or lack thereof for an EPDP for an issue report. And so why you might not need an issue report is for a couple of reasons. So the topic can be narrow, or I guess the issue can be narrow and basically not a widely expansive set of issues. And then the other really big significant part and applicable to this area is whether or not the topic is well scoped. And there's quite a bit of extensive material already existing. And so that extensive material in this case is the work that the subpro group did, and then also the staff report, the 6-part staff report that Satish mentioned as well. So in this case, it's because there's a narrow issue and that there's quite a bit of it already existing work that's been done. Those are the primary reasons why there's an expedited PDP, which actually doesn't necessarily mean that the work that the group will do is intended to go fast, but it usually is the circumstances because of the narrow focus of EPDPs generally. Hopefully that helps. Thanks.
Yes, this is Alfredo. Thank you, Steve, for that explanation. But that brings me back to my original question. If this is an EPDP, there's an expectancy that there should be a report coming out, and it has to be based on consensus so that could feed into the other events that need to take place. So I'm just wondering, again, how much time does this group have to invest to produce a report where there should be a consensus or positive recommendations to move forward the other work? Thank you.
Thanks, Alfredo. So I think that question is better answered after the first meeting. So you would be aware that this EPDP is headed by Edmund, who's one of the foremost experts in IDNs that we have. And from what I can gather, we don't have too much of time for this EPDP. It has got to be wrapped up reasonably fast. So I think after the first meeting, we'll be able to say what is the likely period of time. And about the consensus process also, we'll have to see how it evolves. There are some contentious issues here. There are 2 schools of thought. The staff report mentions that when you want to apply for an IDN, it should be kind of treated as a separate string. Each variant should be a separate application process. But some parts of the community believe that no, it has to be all in bulk. It has to be just one step, and we can't have multiple strings being applied separately because the fees will go up, the processing time will be much longer, the whole effort will be much longer. So these are contentious, and so it'll be interesting to watch how this unfolds, so that how these are going to be resolved. Obviously, there has to be consensus, and there is also the overriding concern about its effect on stability and resiliency of security, stability, resiliency of the internet itself. There is also concern about the kind of work that the registrars have to do to kind of provide for variance. And there's also this question that again pops up once in a while: is this really worth doing? The answer to that last question is certainly for certain IDNs there has been very fast growth. But if you look at India, which has got so many different scripts, most of the IDNs are still English. And the offtake in the other languages have not been really significant, but things are changing. And in fact, yesterday we had the announcement of the India IGF, which was dead for many years. It has been revived. And they're saying that 10,000 users are going to come to participate in that IGF. If so, it will be one of the largest internet governance meetings in the world. And one of the things that they're trying to push there is IDN-based domain names. So these are a bunch of issues which will come up in the background, but some of them are really central issues for this EPDP. Thanks, Eduardo. You are spot on. This is going to create a lot of issues for universal acceptance. Now, but then, first point is that universal acceptance challenges are not restricted to IDNs. The new GTLD, I was reading about in our at large some mailing list about dot family, how that person had to struggle because nobody would take an email based on dot family for any kind of registration in websites and so on. So that is not an IDN, it is a regular Latin label. But the universal acceptance problem is there for that. So universal acceptance is a bigger problem, and I, as a chair of the UA tech working group, which is supposed to mitigate the UA issues, when this is complete, it will kind of move our goalposts further down the road and making it more challenging. But at the end of it, these are things which probably ought to be done. If you look at the future evolution of the internet, we need a multilingual internet. This may not be the right time to kind of go full hog on IDNs, variants, and so on. But we certainly have to get it done as a community. So universal acceptance, however slow it is, we will have to tackle it. And it might take quite some time and effort, but there's no other way, actually. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Although there would be people who argue that it's just the opposite, it is consolidation of people who speak the same non-Latin language. Now, if you take Spanish, if you want to put niño in a domain name, that N character with the tilde on top is actually not a part of the Latin set. So you cannot encode it. So you will have to have IDNs if you want such a domain name. And what IDNs will do is to kind of bring together speakers of, currently people may be using various mechanisms, but once you have IDNs in a single language, then they can all work together, they can come together and consolidate as a community, online community. But there is this element of, if you get an email from an unknown source and it looks very weird, what can you do with it? How do you trust this? So we need a mechanism that can, show any IDN domain name or email ID in some kind of in some form that we can understand. That's still a challenge ahead. Maybe somebody can develop a tool that does it. But I understand your question and where it's coming from. It's absolutely correct.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's David Mackey for the record. It's the comment I have is a kind of a response to your, Eduardo, what you were saying, and maybe I'll roll it into a question for Satish. When you say that, Eduardo, when you say that there's an aspect where it's creating fragmentation, I would suggest to you that that is not true if you look at it from different human populations. If you look at it from a computer perspective and a current internet perspective, you are right. But if you're looking at it from the end user, the existing end users outside of the internet, we have groups, we have communities in the world population that are not connected through language. So maybe the question goes to Satish, is when I'm describing the difference between human populations communicating versus human populations communicating over the internet, do you think that I'm on the right track? And if yes, is there also going to be a need for some sort of translation capabilities in the future beyond the very basic mechanisms of what the work that's going on with IDNs? And thank you very much, Satish. Very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it is absolutely correct that we need some, what they call interlingua, which means some representation that can be understood from, like I said, the domain name itself has no semantic content. It is just a mnemonic. It could be an abbreviation. So how do we make sense of such a thing if you are confronted with a message from such an email ID? So the difficulty that is obvious is that we do not know how to trust, whether to trust such a thing at all. And we have no tools right now, except maybe Google Translate, which does not do a good job on this kind of data, to make sense of it. Now, the only way to kind of handle this is to perhaps the registries for each of these scripts should, have some mechanism whereby the rest of the world can meaningfully decode, at least to some extent. It may not be 100% possible. But in principle, it would be nice to have a tool that will allow us to kind of look at all these different domain labels and make sense of them. And if somebody comes out with a tool, I think it will be wonderful. But there are constraints at this point, and I'm not sure that is basically, although it relates to IDNs, it is, I suspect, outside ICANN's remit. So it has got to be an independent, when you have sufficient number of people using these IDN domain names, then there'll be a natural requirement for such a tool. And I'm sure somebody can consider developing such a tool. But a very valid point indeed.